Hello, and welcome back, or welcome to the first time, to Just One Line, the podcast in which I view a work of literature through the lens of a single line or a single sentence. I'm Bill Preston, writer and former teacher. Today I'm having a look at F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. To immediately jump to the specific, I'm having us consider the book through one sentence on page 25 of the Scribner edition, a sentence that comes as Tom Buchanan ushers narrator Nick Carraway into Wilson's garage. Quote, "The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner." And my pause there after "the interior was unprosperous and bare" is a semicolon. Some elements of this sentence immediately make sense, even to a first-time reader, providing us information on character and setting. Fitzgerald largely isolates that information to the first part of the sentence, prior to the semicolon, the first independent clause. Wilson's garage is a poor establishment. It's a contrast to the man with whom Wilson's wife, Myrtle, is having an affair. Whereas Tom Buchanan has so much wealth he can buy horses and build a barn for them as well as a garage for his cars, this man's repair shop is itself in need of repair. The larger scene around this sentence also introduces the man who will shoot Gatsby. We learn about the dependent relationship he has with Tom. This garage is the place Gatsby's car passes twice, the place where Myrtle will be briefly imprisoned. Outside the garage doors, Myrtle will die. Tom will return there to put the gun in Wilson's hand. But then there's the second part of the sentence with its crouching car. Cars themselves in the novel as a motif, that is, a repeated image or idea, do a lot of work in this book. They're a part of the novel's discussion of the modern world's idea of social class. Cars represent their drivers, a common idea in American culture then and now. Tom, introduced as a racist, obsessed with ideas from what is now a century ago about white people being replaced, is appalled to see black men driving an identical car as they head into the city. Gatsby's car, which is aesthetically overdone, indicates the way someone forcing their way into a higher social class is seen as having terrible aesthetic taste. His house is described as a monstrosity for the same reason. The wreck of a car in this scene is one more indication of the squalor of Wilson's situation. What else? Why is the car crouching? And we have to see that image. If something is crouching, is it in response to being cowed? Is it preparing to leap? What has put it in a crouching position? Here we get into Fitzgerald's use of rhetorical language. Throughout the book, inanimate objects take on traits we typically ascribe to humans. It's not exactly that familiar rhetorical advice we all learned to call personification. At least I wouldn't call it that, because Fitzgerald's purposes are different than when someone writes about, say, an angry storm or a resilient tree. And Fitzgerald even flips the way personification works. Fitzgerald says Nick and Mr. McKee groan down in the elevator, but it's the elevator making noise which deeply complicates what Fitzgerald is suggesting about Nick and McKee. After the car accident at Gatsby's party, we see an uncertain dancing shoe. But it's the person whose foot that is who is uncertain. In both of those examples, wherever the modifiers land, Fitzgerald's not telling you anything about the object, per se, but about the people connected to the object. Multiple car accidents occur in the novel, but none of them involve this crouching car. Tom will take Gatsby's car to get back at him for taking Daisy, but that's not this car. Myrtle will be run over, but not by this car. One way to see this sentence, or at least this part of the sentence, is that Wilson, who is the one who is crouching, a damaged man in a failing business and a failed marriage, not fully realizing he's under the thumb of Tom Buchanan, even at the end when he has done Buchanan's will and destroyed Gatsby. Wilson does finally leap from his crouch, emerging from the bushes around Gatsby's pool to put a bullet in the man. Playwright and short story writer Anton Chekhov gives us the concept we now call Chekhov's gun. He didn't call it that, of course, but several times in his writing, he elaborated on the idea that elements early in a play or work of literature must prepare us for what comes later. He also, relatedly, wrote that elements that don't contribute toward the plot's outcome could be discarded. Now, Chekhov himself did not follow these pieces of advice, but Fitzgerald is, I think, in his modernist way, addressing them. The Great Gatsby is, to quote a character from King Lear, a story marred in the telling, or so Fitzgerald, through Nick, leads us to believe. Dozens of pages go by before we even meet Gatsby, who is, I would argue, not the protagonist, but a kind of distorted mirror version of Nick, the actual protagonist. We see and know only what Nick sees, what Nick chooses to tell us, and what Nick pieces together from what other people tell him. And what does Nick see? Parties and people in the first several chapters, and he's too drunk after one party to even remember what he did afterwards. 1/3 of the way through the book, Nick criticizes his own storytelling by saying that he has, quote, given the wrong impression of how he spent his time that summer. Ignore most of what I've told you, he seems to say. Fitzgerald, you see, is concealing the plot and even suggesting that there isn't one. If I asked you after the first 3 chapters to describe the plot, you'd have nothing to say. The plot doesn't exist. If you knew nothing of the book, you'd be surprised to learn that the story Nick is telling is about his proximity to a murder and how he has, like Melville's Ishmael, gone off on this adventure and lived to tell the tale. Because the story, not the plot, not the individual events, but the story is about Nick. The connections he sees between himself and Gatsby, his own moral failings, the things he doesn't do, the words he doesn't say that might have prevented this tragic outcome. Like the mouthless face of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, Nick observes but does not speak. Despite his introductory statement that he withholds judgment, the only things Nick withholds are the secrets he keeps that might have saved Gatsby's life. He absolutely judges everyone in the book. There's a distance between intention and action for everyone and everything in the novel. When people get exactly what they want, the consequences are disastrous or just plain wrong. Jordan cheats at golf in order to win. Tom does whatever he wants to create some imagined version of the world. Gatsby acts on the belief that the past and the present are interchangeable, and everyone is damaged in that sequence of events. And the novel itself functions in the same way. Each event has its own cast of characters and its own explanation in the moment. In the end, however, Gatsby is dead. No one set out to do that, except, of course, the author. In the structure of the book and in the very sentences, Fitzgerald wants us to consider. When we reflect on any terrible outcome, what is our own culpability in the chain of events? And what are the ways we use language and storytelling to distance ourselves from that culpability? Thanks for listening.